Welcome back to the channel. Today we are diving deep into one of the most iconic animated films ever made. A movie that completely changed the way we look at animated storytelling. A film that broke every single rule of the traditional fairy tale and delivered something the world had never seen before. We are talking about Shrek, the 2001 animated masterpiece that took the entire world by storm and left a legacy that still stands strong more than 2 decades later. So sit back, get comfortable, and let us get into every single detail of this legendary film. Shrek is a computer-animated fantasy comedy film that was released in the year 2001. The film was produced by DreamWorks Animation and distributed by DreamWorks Pictures. It is based on a 1990 picture book of the same name written by William Steig. The screenplay was written by Ted Elliott, Terry Rossio, Joe Stillman, and Roger S. H. Schulman. The film was directed by Andrew Adamson and Vicki Jensen, both of whom brought an extraordinary vision to this project that no one could have anticipated. This movie was made in the United States of America, and it comes from the studio DreamWorks Animation, which was founded by Steven Spielberg, Jeffrey Katzenberg, and David Geffen. DreamWorks had already established itself in the animation world, but Shrek was an entirely different level of achievement. The film used cutting-edge computer-generated imagery, commonly known as CGI, to bring its characters and world to life in a way that had never been done before with such detail, texture, and personality. DreamWorks intentionally created Shrek as a response and a challenge to the classic fairy tale formula that Disney had long dominated. Jeffrey Katzenberg, who had previously worked at Disney, poured a great deal of personal passion into this project, and it showed in every frame of the finished film. The movie runs for approximately 90 minutes and carries a PG rating, meaning it was designed to be enjoyed by families and children while also carrying layers of humor, satire, and heart that adults could fully appreciate. It was not simply a children's movie. It was a cultural statement. Shrek challenged the idea that heroes have to be handsome princes, that princesses must be rescued and remain perfect, and that fairy tales must follow a clean and predictable path. It took all of those conventions and turned them completely upside down, and audiences everywhere loved every moment of it. Plot details. The story begins in a swamp. A large, green, terrifying-looking ogre named Shrek lives alone in a swamp deep in a fairy tale land. He has built his entire life around his solitude. He does not want company. He does not want friends. He is perfectly content being alone, feared by the nearby villagers, and left in peace. His routine is simple and his happiness comes from the quiet and privacy of his home. However, that peace is violently disrupted when a massive wave of fairy tale creatures suddenly floods his swamp. Talking animals, fairy tale beings of all kinds, and dozens of storybook characters are dumped right onto his land, sent there by order of the ruler of the land, Lord Farquaad. Lord Farquaad is the tiny but enormously power-hungry ruler of a kingdom called Duloc. He has made it his mission to banish all fairy tale creatures from his kingdom because he considers them to be impure and unworthy of his perfect, orderly land. He rounds them all up and exiles them to Shrek's swamp, effectively destroying the one thing Shrek values most, which is his privacy and solitude. Shrek, furious and desperate to get his swamp back, decides to travel to Duloc and confront Farquaad directly. Along the way, he runs into a fast-talking, relentlessly cheerful and impossibly persistent donkey who has also been exiled. Despite Shrek's best efforts to shake him off, Donkey follows him, and the two of them, as mismatched as any duo could possibly be, begin their journey to Duloc together. When they arrive at Duloc, they interrupt a tournament that Lord Farquaad has organized. The tournament is meant to determine which knight will be sent on a dangerous quest to rescue Princess Fiona from a castle guarded by a fearsome dragon. Shrek and Donkey end up winning the tournament, and Lord Farquaad strikes a deal with Shrek. If Shrek rescues the princess, Farquaad will return his swamp to him, free of all the fairy tale creatures. Shrek agrees, seeing it as a simple transaction that will solve his problem. Shrek and Donkey travel to the ruined castle where Princess Fiona is being held. The castle is crumbling and dangerous, and at its heart, a massive fire-breathing dragon guards the princess. Donkey, in one of the most entertaining sequences of the film, ends up charming the dragon, who turns out to be female and becomes quite taken with Donkey. Shrek meanwhile rescues Fiona, who had expected a handsome prince to come for her. She is surprised, confused, and initially quite unhappy to find that her rescuer is an ogre. Shrek is equally uninterested in pleasantries and just wants to complete the mission and return to his swamp. The journey back to Duloc is where the heart of the film truly begins. Fiona is funny, sharp, fierce, and completely unlike what Shrek expected. She kicks, punches, and fights when needed. She is not a helpless princess. The three of them travel together, and slowly but genuinely, Shrek and Fiona begin to develop real feelings for each other. Their connection grows through shared humor, honesty, and a mutual sense of not belonging to the world that surrounds them. There is, however, a secret that Fiona has been hiding her entire life. Each night at sunset, she transforms into an ogre herself, returning to human form only when the sun rises. A spell was placed on her long ago, and it can only be broken by true love's kiss. She is desperately ashamed of her ogre form and hides it at all costs. Donkey eventually discovers her secret and promises to keep it. When they get close to Duloc, Shrek overhears a fragment of conversation between Fiona and Donkey that he completely misunderstands. He believes Fiona is mocking him and calling him a hideous ogre. Heartbroken and angry, he shuts back down and delivers Fiona to Lord Farquaad without saying anything. Farquaad, who needs to marry a princess to be declared a true king, immediately proposes to Fiona and she agrees, seeing no other path. Shrek returns to his swamp, gets it back exactly as he wanted, but finds it completely empty and hollow. He is miserable. Donkey comes back to confront him and tells him the truth about the conversation and about how Fiona actually felt. Shrek realizes his mistake and rushes to stop the wedding. He arrives at the wedding ceremony just as the sun is setting. He confesses his feelings to Fiona in front of everyone. She is moved, and when the sun fully sets, she transforms into her ogre form in front of the entire crowd. Lord Farquaad is disgusted and orders Shrek to be arrested and Fiona to be thrown in the dungeon. But Donkey, in a perfect moment of timing and friendship, calls the dragon, who arrives and eats Lord Farquaad entirely. Shrek and Fiona share their true love's kiss. The spell breaks, but not in the way Fiona expected. Instead of becoming permanently human, she becomes permanently an ogre, because her true form was always the form of her true love. The two of them are married in the swamp, surrounded by all the fairy tale creatures, and Donkey and the dragon are revealed to have begun their own unusual romance. The film ends with celebration, joy, and a complete redefinition of what a fairy tale ending looks like. Cast. The voice cast of Shrek is one of the most memorable and perfectly assembled casts in animation history. Mike Myers voices the character of Shrek himself. Myers brought a Scottish accent to the role, which was not the original plan but became absolutely iconic. His performance gives Shrek depth, warmth, humor, and a genuine emotional weight that makes the audience root for him completely. Eddie Murphy voices Donkey, and it is widely considered one of the greatest voice performances in animated film history. Murphy improvised a great deal of his dialogue, bringing an energy and a comedic timing to Donkey that simply cannot be taught. Every scene that Donkey is in becomes funnier because of Murphy's presence. Cameron Diaz voices Princess Fiona. She gives Fiona confidence, humor, and a vulnerability that makes her feel like a real and complete character rather than simply a plot device. Fiona is not a passive princess, and Diaz captures that perfectly. John Lithgow voices Lord Farquaad. Despite having relatively limited screen time compared to the main three, Lithgow creates a villain who is hilarious, pathetic, and genuinely threatening all at once. The character works because Lithgow commits to every line completely. The supporting cast includes many smaller but memorable voice performances that fill out the world of the film beautifully and contribute to the richness of its fairy tale setting. Release date and box office. Shrek was officially released in the United States on May 18, 2001. The film had its world premiere at the Cannes Film Festival, which was a remarkable moment for an animated feature and signaled that this was not being treated as a simple children's cartoon but as a serious cinematic achievement. The film was a massive commercial success. It earned over $484 million worldwide at the box office against a production budget of approximately $60 million. It became one of the highest-grossing films of 2001 and demonstrated that animated films could compete at the absolute highest level of mainstream cinema. The film received overwhelming critical acclaim. Critics praised its humor, its heart, its groundbreaking animation, and its clever subversion of fairy tale tropes. It holds a very high approval rating to this day and is consistently listed among the greatest animated films ever made. At the Academy Awards, Shrek made history by winning the very first ever Oscar for Best Animated Feature, a category that had just been introduced that year. This award cemented its place in cinema history and validated everything that DreamWorks had set out to achieve with it. The film also won a BAFTA award and numerous other honors from film critics and industry bodies around the world. Legacy and impact. The legacy of Shrek extends far beyond its box office numbers and its awards. It fundamentally changed the landscape of animated filmmaking. It proved that animation aimed at families could be sharp, satirical, emotionally layered, and culturally relevant in ways that appealed to adults just as powerfully as to children. It also demonstrated that CGI animation could achieve a level of visual richness and character expression that was genuinely breathtaking. The film spawned one of the most successful animated franchises in history, including Shrek 2 in 2004, Shrek the Third in 2007, and Shrek Forever After in 2010, as well as the spin-off films featuring Puss in Boots. Beyond the films, Shrek became a Broadway musical, a theme park attraction at Universal Studios, and one of the most enduring pop culture icons of the 21st century. Shrek also has a unique second life as an internet phenomenon. Decades after its release, the character and the film's humor have been embraced by internet culture in a way that has introduced the film to entirely new generations of viewers. Memes, fan edits, and online communities dedicated to Shrek have kept the film in constant conversation in ways that no one in 2001 could have predicted. The original book by William Steig was a short picture book with a very simple story, but the filmmakers took that material and transformed it into something genuinely rich and layered. The decision to use popular contemporary music rather than traditional musical numbers was also a significant creative choice that gave the film a distinctive modern energy that set it apart from everything else in the genre. Shrek 2001, complete story in full detail. The beginning, Shrek and his swamp. The story of Shrek begins in a quiet, muddy, beautifully isolated swamp located somewhere deep within a magical fairy tale land. The swamp is not a glamorous place by any standard. It is full of mud, strange plants, murky water, and the kind of thick, overgrown wilderness that most people would go out of their way to avoid. But for one particular creature, this swamp is not just a home. It is a paradise. It is everything he has ever wanted and everything he believes he deserves. That creature is Shrek. He is a large, green ogre with enormous ears, a rounded head, and a body built like a small mountain. By every conventional standard of fairy tale storytelling, he is a monster. He is the kind of creature that villagers tell stories about to frighten their children. He is the thing that hides in the dark and goes bump in the night. He is, in the most traditional sense of the word, a beast. But Shrek does not see himself as a monster. He sees himself as a private individual who simply wants to be left alone. He wakes up in the morning, tends to his swamp, makes his meals from whatever the swamp provides, and goes about his days in complete and total solitude. He bathes in the mud. He eats unusual things with great enthusiasm. He reads by candlelight at night and sleeps soundly without a single worry in the world. He is, in his own strange and unconventional way, completely at peace with himself and his life. The opening of the film shows a Shrek reading from a fairy tale book, the kind of book that describes beautiful princesses locked in towers and brave knights on white horses coming to rescue them. He reads this passage with complete dismissal and then slams the book shut, using its pages for an entirely different and unglamorous purpose. This single moment tells us everything we need to know about Shrek. He has no interest in fairy tales. He has no interest in romance or adventure or heroism. He wants his swamp, his privacy, and his peace. Nothing more and nothing less. When he steps outside, a group of nearby villagers who have come armed with torches and pitchforks to drive him away quickly scatter at the sight of him. Shrek does not even have to fight them. He simply roars, and they run. He watches them flee with a satisfied smirk, completely unbothered and entirely content. This is his life, and he loves it exactly as it is. The disruption. Fairy tale creatures invade the swamp. Everything changes without any warning one morning when Shrek steps outside to find that his swamp has been completely overrun. Dozens upon dozens of fairy tale creatures have arrived overnight and taken up residence in and around his home. There are talking pigs, the 3 bears from the famous story, Pinocchio, the 3 blind mice, the gingerbread man, Little Red Riding Hood, the big bad wolf, Magic Mirror, and every other fairy tale being one could imagine, all crammed into his swamp with nowhere else to go. Shrek is stunned. He is furious. He demands to know what is happening and why all of these creatures have invaded his private space. The creatures explain, in various and panicked ways, that they have been rounded up and forcibly relocated. They did not choose to come to the swamp. They were sent there by someone in power who wanted them gone from their homes. That someone is Lord Farquaad, the ruler of a kingdom called Duloc. Farquaad is a peculiar figure. He is extremely short in stature but compensates for this with an outsized obsession with power, order, and the appearance of perfection. He has decided that fairy tale creatures are impure and disruptive to his vision of a perfect kingdom, and so he has had every single one of them rounded up and expelled from Duloc. He dumped them in Shrek's swamp simply because it was outside his borders and therefore outside his concern. Shrek understands immediately that if he wants his swamp back, he is going to have to deal with Lord Farquaad directly. He cannot simply wait for the creatures to leave on their own, because they have nowhere to go. He decides to march to Duloc, confront Farquaad, and demand that his swamp be returned to its original empty and peaceful state. The meeting of Shrek and Donkey. As Shrek is preparing to leave for Duloc, he encounters one particular fairy tale creature who is different from all the others. This is Donkey, a small, gray, talking donkey with enormous eyes and an absolutely inexhaustible supply of words. Donkey was on his way to being captured by Farquaad's soldiers when Shrek inadvertently helped him escape simply by being terrifying enough to scatter the guards. Donkey, in his gratitude and his loneliness and his natural inability to be quiet, immediately latches onto Shrek as his new best friend. Shrek absolutely does not want a best friend. He does not want any friend at all. He wants to be alone. He wants quiet. He wants exactly the opposite of everything that Donkey represents. But no matter how many times he tells Donkey to go away, no matter how many times he insists that he is a terrifying ogre, and that Donkey should be afraid of him, Donkey simply will not leave. He is impressed by Shrek rather than frightened of him. He finds Shrek interesting and funny and worth following. This dynamic, the grumpy solitary ogre, and the relentlessly cheerful and chatty Donkey, is the beating heart of the entire film. Their chemistry is immediate and genuine, even when Shrek is trying his hardest to push Donkey away. Donkey talks about everything. He talks about his feelings, his fears, his hopes, the scenery around them, the things he sees, and things that have nothing to do with anything. Shrek grunts, sighs, and tries to pretend he is not entertained. But he is. Anyone watching can see that he is, even if Shrek himself refuses to admit it. The two of them agree, more or less, to travel together to Duloc. Shrek because he needs to confront Farquaad, and Donkey because he has decided that Shrek is his friend and is therefore going wherever Shrek goes. Lord Farquaad and his plan. In the kingdom of Duloc, we get our first proper look at Lord Farquaad. Duloc is immaculate. Every building is perfectly uniform. Every surface is spotlessly clean. There is a strange robotic cheerfulness to the kingdom, with small welcome figures and singing children, all of it perfectly controlled and carefully maintained to project an image of absolute order and perfection. It is a kingdom that looks like it has been designed rather than lived in. Lord Farquaad himself is obsessed with becoming a legitimate king. The problem is that by the laws of his land, a person can only be a true king if they are married to a princess. Farquaad has no princess. He has power, he has soldiers, he has a kingdom, but without a royal marriage, his title is technically incomplete, and he knows it. To solve this problem, he has his magic mirror present him with options. The mirror, which works somewhat like a twisted game show, presents 3 princesses for Farquaad to choose from. He chooses Princess Fiona, a young woman with flowing red hair who is being kept locked in a castle surrounded by fire and guarded by a dragon. The mirror notes that she comes with some complications, but Farquaad cuts him off before he can explain. He does not want to hear about complications. He wants a princess, and he wants her delivered to him so that he can marry her and claim his full title as king. Since the castle is extraordinarily dangerous and Farquaad has no desire whatsoever to risk his own safety, he decides to hold a tournament. Knights from across the land will compete, and whoever wins will be given the honor of undertaking the quest to rescue Princess Fiona. The tournament and the deal. Shrek and Donkey arrive in Duloc right in the middle of this tournament. They walk into an arena full of knights and immediately draw attention simply by existing. Farquaad's knights, rather than sending them to meet with the Lord directly, decide to fight them. What follows is a genuinely entertaining sequence in which Shrek, who is enormously strong and has spent his whole life defending himself from villagers with pitchforks, handles every single knight with ease. He does not set out to be impressive. He is simply impossible to stop. Donkey contributes in his own chaotic way, and together they make a mess of the entire tournament. Lord Farquaad, watching from his high seat, is not angry. He is intrigued. He sees an opportunity. He calls Shrek forward and proposes a deal. If Shrek will go to the dragon's castle, rescue Princess Fiona, and bring her back safely to Duloc, Farquaad will issue a royal decree returning Shrek's swamp to him and removing all the fairy tale creatures from it. Shrek thinks about this for approximately no time at all. It is exactly what he needs. He gets his swamp back, the creatures have somewhere else to go, and Farquaad gets his princess. It seems like a straightforward and clean arrangement for everyone involved. He agrees. Donkey, naturally, insists on going with him. Shrek tries to dissuade him and fails completely. Donkey comes along. The journey to the dragon's castle. The two of them travel through the countryside toward the ruined castle where Princess Fiona is being held. Along the way, in what becomes one of the most beloved conversations in the film, they have a discussion about ogres and layers. Donkey is trying to understand Shrek, asking him questions, pushing past the surface. Shrek explains that ogres are like onions. They have layers. There is more to them than what appears on the outside. Donkey misses the point entirely and suggests that Shrek is more like a cake, warm and welcoming on the inside. Shrek finds this deeply frustrating, but the conversation reveals something important. Shrek is not simply a monster who wants to be left alone. He is a creature who has been rejected and judged his entire life based solely on his appearance, and he has responded to that rejection by building walls around himself so thick that no one can ever get close enough to hurt him again. As they travel, the castle comes into view. It is an enormous, crumbling ruin perched at the edge of a massive volcanic crater. The ground around it is covered in the remains and helmets of knights who tried to reach it before and failed. Lava flows beneath a rickety rope bridge that is the only way across. Everything about the place says that what lies inside is incredibly dangerous, and that turning around would be the smart choice. Shrek is not deterred. He strides forward with complete confidence, and Donkey follows, considerably less confidently but following nonetheless. The Dragon and the Rescue of Princess Fiona. Inside the castle, they split up to find the princess faster. Shrek goes to find Fiona while Donkey explores another part of the castle and runs directly into the dragon. The dragon is enormous, bright red, and breathes fire with great enthusiasm. She is, by every measure, terrifying. But Donkey, in a moment of sheer panic combined with his natural inability to shut up, starts talking to the dragon. He compliments her. He tells her she has beautiful eyes. He is rambling desperately in an attempt to avoid being eaten, but something unexpected happens. The dragon responds to his flattery. She is charmed. She picks Donkey up gently and carries him around, clearly taken with him in a way that nobody, least of all Donkey, was prepared for. The dragon is lonely, it turns out, and Donkey's genuine if terrified attention is something she finds impossible to resist. Meanwhile, Shrek makes his way to the tower where Princess Fiona is sleeping. He finds her lying on a bed in a very dramatic pose, as though she has staged the whole thing for maximum fairy tale effect. He wakes her up and tells her they need to go. Fiona opens her eyes, looks at her rescuer, and immediately expects the whole romantic scene that she has been imagining and preparing for her entire life. She waits for him to take off his helmet. He is not wearing a helmet. She sees his green face and enormous ears and is deeply confused. She asks him if he is her knight in shining armor. He says he is a knight more or less. She asks if they are going to share true love's kiss. He says absolutely not. They are leaving right now. She is flustered, offended, and not at all prepared for this version of a rescue. But she goes with him because she has been locked in that tower for an extremely long time, and leaving, even with an ogre, is better than staying. They find Donkey and the dragon together in a complicated situation that they extract themselves from by running very fast across the rope bridge. The dragon follows, breathing fire. And at the last moment Shrek cuts the bridge, sending the dragon plunging into the lava below while the three of them land safely on the other side. They look back at the destroyed bridge and the dragon, who disappears from view, and begin their journey back to Duloc with the princess. The journey back, Shrek and Fiona falling in love. This section of the film is where everything truly begins to bloom. The three of them travel through the countryside together, and day by day, hour by hour, Shrek and Fiona begin to genuinely connect with each other in ways that neither of them anticipated or wanted. Fiona is not what Shrek expected. He expected a delicate, passive, helpless princess who would be grateful and quiet. Instead, Fiona is funny and bold and fiercely capable. When they encounter Robin Hood and his merry men in the forest, who attempt to rescue Fiona from her supposed captors, she handles them with breathtaking physical skill, fighting them off with elegant and powerful martial arts moves that leave everyone, including Shrek, completely stunned. She is not waiting to be saved. She never was. Shrek, on the other hand, is not what Fiona expected. She expected a prince beneath the unusual exterior, some kind of misunderstanding that would resolve itself into conventional romance. But Shrek is simply Shrek. He is gruff and sarcastic and not interested in performing heroism for anyone. And yet he is genuinely funny, surprisingly thoughtful, and deeply kind in ways that he tries very hard to hide. He makes her laugh. He treats her like a person rather than a prize. They make balloon animals from frogs and snakes. They chase fireflies and look at the stars together. They have conversations that flow easily and naturally, conversations between two people who are surprised to find that they understand each other. Donkey watches all of this with the delighted satisfaction of someone who has been rooting for this outcome from the very beginning, which he absolutely has been. Every night as the sun goes down, however, Fiona excuses herself urgently and finds somewhere private to spend the night alone. She is deeply insistent about this, and while Shrek and Donkey find it odd, they do not press too hard at first. Fiona's secret. The truth is revealed when Donkey, looking for Fiona one evening, finds her in the windmill where she has been sleeping. He sees her in her ogre form and is genuinely shocked. Fiona transforms back to human when the sun rises, and she explains the situation to Donkey in full. When she was a young girl, a curse was placed on her. Every night at sunset she transforms into an ogre. Every morning at sunrise she returns to human form. The only way to break the curse permanently is to receive true love's kiss, and when that happens, love's true form will be revealed. She has spent her entire life believing that this means she will become permanently human once she finds her prince, because surely her true form is the beautiful princess and not the green ogre. She is desperate and ashamed and has kept this secret hidden from everyone because she cannot bear to be seen as a monster. Donkey, to his enormous credit, is genuinely warm about the whole thing. He tells her she is not as horrible as she might think. He promises to keep her secret, and he does, though the situation becomes complicated very quickly. The misunderstanding that breaks everything. As they draw closer to Duloc, Shrek overhears a conversation between Fiona and Donkey. He approaches to tell Fiona something, carrying a sunflower he picked for her, a small and entirely uncharacteristic romantic gesture that cost him a great deal of pride to even consider. But he hears Fiona's voice before she sees him, and in the conversation she is having with Donkey about her feelings, he catches only a fragment. He hears her say that no one could ever love someone like her, that she is hideous, that whoever could care for something so ugly. He does not hear the full context. He does not realize she is talking about herself and her own shame about her ogre form. He thinks she is talking about him. He thinks she finds him repulsive and has been laughing at him this whole time. He drops the sunflower. He walks away. He closes every door inside himself that had quietly and slowly been opening over the course of their journey. By the time they reach the gates of Duloc, Shrek has rebuilt every wall he ever had and then some. He delivers Fiona to Lord Farquaad coldly and without explanation, accepts the return of his swamp, and prepares to go home. Fiona is devastated and completely confused. She does not understand why he has suddenly become cold and distant when everything seemed to be going so beautifully. She looks for some sign of the Shrek she traveled with and finds none. He is gone. The deal is done. She is handed over to Farquaad, who proposes to her immediately, and sets a wedding date for that very day before the sun sets. Shrek alone in the swamp. Shrek returns to his swamp. It has been cleared of all the fairy tale creatures, exactly as agreed. The mud is his again. The solitude is his again. Everything is exactly as it was before any of this started. He has everything he wanted when this whole journey began. And he is completely and utterly miserable. He sits alone and tries to convince himself that this is what he wanted, that he is perfectly happy, that none of what happened with Fiona matters. He tries to go back to his routine. He makes his meals. He bathes in the mud. He does all the things that used to make him happy, and none of them work. The silence, which used to be a comfort, now feels like an absence. The swamp feels not like a paradise, but like an exile that he has chosen for himself. Donkey arrives. He is hurt and angry with Shrek, not just about the way Shrek treated Fiona but about the way Shrek treated him too, shutting him out without explanation after everything they had been through together. He confronts Shrek directly and refuses to let Shrek hide behind his usual armor of gruffness. He tells Shrek the truth. He tells him what Fiona was actually saying, that she was talking about herself, about her own shame and her own fear of being unlovable. She was not mocking Shrek. She was expressing her own deepest insecurity. Shrek takes this in. He understands in an instant the scale of what he has misunderstood, and what he has thrown away because of it. He also comes to understand, perhaps for the first time with any real clarity, that he is not actually fine being alone. He has been telling himself that story for so long that he started to believe it. But it was never really true. He just never had anyone who made him feel like there was another way to live. He has to get to that wedding. He has to get there before it is too late. The rescue. Shrek stops the wedding. Shrek and Donkey rush to Duloc. In a moment that is genuinely exciting and triumphant, Donkey lets out a tremendous sound that echoes across the landscape, and the dragon appears. She has followed Donkey all this way, still completely devoted to him in her enormous and fire-breathing way. The dragon carries them both through the sky toward Duloc at speed, arriving just as the wedding ceremony is reaching its final moments inside the grand cathedral. Shrek bursts through the stained glass window of the cathedral at the exact moment that the sun is setting. Chaos erupts throughout the congregation. Farquaad, enraged, orders his guards to seize Shrek and throw him out. But Shrek calls out to Fiona, and she turns, and she sees him, and for a moment everything else stops. He stands in the middle of the cathedral and tells her how he feels. He is not elegant about it. He is not poetic. He is Shrek, which means he is clumsy and direct and genuine in a way that is more powerful than any perfectly composed speech could ever be. He tells her he was wrong. He tells her he heard something and he misunderstood, and he should have trusted her. He tells her what he cannot quite say in words simply by being there at all, by having crossed the distance and broken through the wall, and showed up, which is something Shrek does not do for anyone. The sun finishes setting. Fiona transforms. Her ogre form appears in front of the entire congregation, in front of Lord Farquaad, in front of everyone. The secret she has carried her entire life is exposed completely and publicly. She is devastated and humiliated. Farquaad is disgusted. He calls her hideous. He tells the guards to arrest Shrek and lock Fiona in a tower where she will spend the rest of her life as Farquaad's queen, kept hidden from the world. He is furious and cold and reveals in this moment exactly what he is, which is a man who wanted a princess as a symbol rather than as a person. But Farquaad does not get to finish his sentence. Because at that moment, Donkey's dragon companion crashes through the wall of the cathedral. The dragon looks at Farquaad. Farquaad looks at the dragon. And the dragon eats him. It is quick, it is decisive, and it is enormously satisfying. True love's kiss and the breaking of the curse. With Farquaad gone and the soldiers standing down in confusion, Shrek and Fiona are left facing each other in the cathedral. Shrek steps toward her. He tells her that she is beautiful. He means it in every sense. Not in spite of what she looks like, not as a consolation, but genuinely and completely. She is beautiful to him because she is Fiona, all of Fiona, every version and every form, and he would not change a single thing. They share their first kiss. It is the true love's kiss that the curse has been waiting for. Light swirls around Fiona and she is lifted into the air in a cascade of magic as the curse finally breaks after all the years she has spent waiting for this moment. The magic settles. Fiona comes back down. And when she does, she is an ogre. Not temporarily, not accidentally, but permanently and completely. Because the curse said that love's true form would be revealed, and love's true form turned out to be this. Her true self, the one that was always there beneath the human exterior she wore in daylight, is the green, round, full-cheeked ogre that she transforms into every night. And that is the form that her true love loves. And so that is the form she takes forever. Fiona is stunned at first. she expected to become human. But she looks at Shrek, and she sees no disappointment there, no hesitation, no wish that things were different. He looks at her like she is exactly what he hoped for. And she understands something that the fairy tale book she grew up with never told her. That the ending is not about becoming what everyone else expects you to be. It is about becoming fully and permanently yourself, with someone beside you who loves that exact person. The celebration and the ending. The wedding, the real one, takes place in the swamp. It is nothing like the formal ceremony in Duloc's cathedral. It is muddy and chaotic and filled with fairy tale creatures of every kind, all celebrating with tremendous enthusiasm. Donkey gives Shrek away, in the most literal and enthusiastic interpretation of that tradition possible. The swamp is decorated in the most swamp-like way imaginable, and it is somehow perfect. Shrek and Fiona are married, surrounded by everyone, by the creatures who filled the swamp at the beginning of the story and who have apparently adopted it as their permanent home regardless of anyone's original plans. The party is loud and joyful and completely unruly, which is to say it is exactly right. And Donkey, it is revealed, has his own complicated but clearly mutual romance with the dragon, who is as devoted to him as ever. They are, in their own way, a perfect match, which is perhaps the most extreme example the film offers of the idea that love does not follow the rules anyone expects it to. The film ends with Shrek and Fiona riding away from their celebration on a carriage pulled by the dragon, surrounded by music and light and the chaos of a fairy tale world that has been permanently and joyfully rearranged. The deeper story beneath the story. What makes Shrek work as a story beyond its humor and its spectacle is what it is really saying beneath all of it. It is a story about the walls that people build around themselves after they have been rejected enough times. It is a story about the difference between the person the world wants you to be and the person you actually are. It is a story about two individuals, Shrek and Fiona, who have both spent their lives hiding parts of themselves because they believed those parts were too ugly, too wrong, too other for anyone to ever truly accept. Shrek hides behind his reputation as a terrifying monster because it keeps people away before they can reject him. Fiona hides behind her human form because she believes her true self is something shameful and unlovable. And the story brings them together precisely so that they can learn, through each other, that the thing they have been hiding is not something to be ashamed of but is in fact the truest and most lovable part of who they are. The fairy tale world that surrounds them operates on rules about beauty and heroism and perfect romantic endings, and the film systematically and joyfully dismantles every one of those rules. The hero is an ogre. The princess is not waiting passively to be saved. The villain is not dark and powerful but petty and small in every sense. The dragon is not a mindless obstacle but a lonely creature looking for connection. True love's kiss does not create the perfect fairy tale image, but instead reveals reality, as it actually is. That is why Shrek has endured. Not because it is funny, though it is genuinely very funny. Not because it is visually beautiful, though it was remarkable for its time. But because it tells a story that resonates deeply with anyone who has ever felt like they did not fit the mold they were expected to fit, anyone who has ever hidden a part of themselves to avoid rejection, and anyone who has ever found, against all expectation, that being fully and honestly themselves was enough to be loved after all. The actors of Shrek, complete life histories. Mike Myers, the voice of Shrek. Michael John Myers was born on May 25, 1963, in Scarborough, Ontario, which is a suburb located in the eastern part of Toronto, Canada. He was the youngest of three sons born to Alice Elizabeth, who was a secretary, and Eric Myers, who worked for the British Army and later became an insurance agent. His family had roots in Liverpool, England, and both of his parents were British immigrants who had moved to Canada before Mike was born. This British heritage would play a significant role in his life, his humor, and eventually even in his most iconic voice performance. Growing up in Scarborough, Mike Myers was surrounded by comedy from an extremely early age. His father Eric was a passionate lover of British comedy and would regularly sit the family down to watch programs from the United Kingdom, including Monty Python, which had a profound and lasting effect on young Mike. He has spoken many times throughout his career about how watching comedy with his father was one of the foundational experiences of his childhood, not just in terms of his taste in humor but in terms of his relationship with his father, whom he adored deeply. Eric Myers had a playful and imaginative spirit that he passed directly to his youngest son, and Mike absorbed everything. By the time he was a young child, Mike was already performing. He was the kind of kid who was always doing voices, always acting out characters, always finding ways to make the people around him laugh. He attended Sir Robert L. Borden Business and Technical Institute in Scarborough, where he was known for his humor and his willingness to perform. But his training began long before formal education could shape it. He was a natural, and he knew from an extremely young age that performing was not something he wanted to do but something he felt compelled to do, like breathing. At the age of 8 years old, Mike Myers appeared in a Canadian television commercial. This was not a fluke or a coincidence arranged by ambitious parents. He genuinely pursued it, and when the opportunity came, he delivered. It was the beginning of a professional relationship with the camera and the audience that would define the rest of his life. He continued to work in Canadian television and theater through his teenage years, building a foundation of real performance experience that most aspiring entertainers his age simply did not have. When he was in his late teens, Mike Myers made the decision to move to England. He had always felt a deep connection to British culture through his parents and through the comedy he had grown up watching, and he wanted to immerse himself in it properly. He joined the UK improvisational comedy scene and became part of the Comedy Store Players in London, one of the most respected and influential improvisational comedy groups in the country. This experience was enormously formative. Improvisation requires a kind of mental agility, confidence, and deep understanding of character that no script can teach you, and Myers thrived in that environment. He returned to Canada and then moved to the United States, specifically to Chicago, where he joined the legendary Second City comedy troupe. Second City has produced some of the greatest comedic talents in the history of North American entertainment, including John Belushi, Bill Murray, Gilda Radner, Dan Aykroyd, and countless others. For Myers, being part of Second City was both a tremendous honor and an extraordinary education. He worked alongside other exceptional performers, sharpened his instincts, developed his characters, and built the kind of stage experience that would serve him for the rest of his career. His big break on the national stage came in 1989 when he was hired as a cast member on Saturday Night Live, the legendary NBC sketch comedy show that had been a launching pad for major comedy careers since its debut in 1975. Myers joined the show at a time when it was rebuilding after a difficult period, and he became one of its most important and beloved performers almost immediately. His characters were vivid, committed, and endlessly funny. He played Wayne Campbell, the suburban teenager who hosted a public access television show from his basement, with such complete and natural ease that the character felt less like a creation and more like a real person Myers had known his whole life. Wayne Campbell became the vehicle for one of the most successful transitions in the history of comedy film. Wayne's World, the 1992 film based on the Saturday Night Live sketch, was a massive commercial and critical hit that grossed over $183 million worldwide against a modest budget. Myers co-wrote the screenplay and starred in the lead role, and the film introduced him to a global audience that had not necessarily been watching Saturday Night Live. It was a defining moment in his career and established him as a legitimate film star rather than simply a television performer. The sequel, Wayne's World 2, followed in 1993, and while it was less successful than the original, it was still a solid commercial performer. By this point, Myers was firmly established in Hollywood and was developing new projects. He left Saturday Night Live in 1995 after 6 seasons, during which he had created and inhabited an extraordinary range of characters and had become one of the most recognizable faces on American television. In 1997, Myers released Austin Powers, International Man of Mystery, a spy comedy parody that he wrote and starred in. The film had a modest theatrical run but became an absolute sensation on home video, building a cult following so enormous that it essentially transformed into a mainstream phenomenon. The sequel, Austin Powers, The Spy Who Shagged Me, released in 1999, became one of the highest-grossing films of that year, earning over $312 million worldwide. A third film, Austin Powers and Goldmember, followed in 2002. Myers played multiple roles in each film, including Austin Powers himself and the villainous Dr. Evil, both of whom became cultural icons of the late 1990s and early 2000s. The decision to voice Shrek came around this time, and the story of how the character ended up sounding the way he does is fascinating. The original voice that Myers recorded for Shrek was performed in a North American accent, closer to his own natural speaking voice. He completed significant recording work with this approach before deciding that the character needed something different, something that felt more specifically rooted and more emotionally connected to the blue-collar working-class identity that defined Shrek's personality. He suggested a Scottish accent, drawing on the working-class Edinburgh inflection that felt right for a character who was rough around the edges, deeply proud, and completely without pretension. DreamWorks agreed, and the decision to re-record the entire performance in the Scottish accent cost the studio an estimated $5 million in additional work. But the result was undeniably right. The Scottish inflection gave Shrek a specificity and a warmth that the original recording lacked, and Myers' performance became one of the most beloved voice acting achievements in the history of animated film. His personal life has had its share of difficulty and transformation. He was married to Robin Rosen from 1993 until their divorce in 2006. He later married Kelly Tisdale in 2010, and the couple have 3 children together, a son named Spike born in 2011, a daughter named Sunday born in 2014, and a daughter named Paulina born in 2015. His father Eric died of Alzheimer's disease in 1991. A loss that deeply affected Myers and that he has spoken about with great emotion in interviews over the years. The pain of watching his father's decline and ultimate loss is something that has shaped him profoundly, and his work in the years that followed carried a depth of feeling that may well have been informed by that grief. Myers has continued to work in film and television in the years since Shrek, though his output has been less consistent than during his peak years in the 1990s. He appeared in the critically panned The Love Guru in 2008, a film that damaged his reputation somewhat in Hollywood. He returned to the role of Dr. Evil in various appearances over the years. He appeared in Bohemian Rhapsody in 2018, and more recently created and starred in The Pentaverate, a Netflix miniseries released in 2022 in which he played multiple roles in his signature style. Throughout everything, he remains one of the most genuinely talented and technically skilled comedic performers of his generation, a man whose instinct for character, voice, and timing is essentially without equal. Eddie Murphy, the voice of Donkey. Edward Reagan Murphy was born on April 3, 1961, in the Brooklyn neighborhood of Bushwick in New York City. He was the second of 2 sons born to Lillian Lynch, who was a telephone operator, and Charles Edward Murphy, who was a New York City Transit police officer and an amateur comedian and actor. The Murphy household was not wealthy, but it was lively, and even in his earliest years Eddie showed the kind of comedic instinct and natural charisma that could not be taught. His childhood took a dramatically difficult turn when he was only 3 years old. His father, Charles Murphy, was stabbed by a former girlfriend and died from his injuries. The loss of his father at such a young age was a defining event in Eddie's life, one that left a wound that never fully closed. After Charles's death, Lillian struggled to care for her sons and eventually became seriously ill herself, requiring Eddie and his brother Charlie to be placed in a foster home for approximately a year while she recovered. The experience of being separated from his mother and living in an unfamiliar home during his most formative years was a difficult one, and Murphy has spoken about it with candor in various interviews. When his mother recovered, she remarried a man named Vernon Lynch, and the family was reunited. Vernon Lynch became a significant presence in young Eddie's life, and while the relationship was not always simple, it provided a degree of stability that Eddie needed. The family settled in the Roosevelt area of Long Island, in New York, where Eddie grew up and attended school. From a very young age, Eddie Murphy was performing. He would mimic the voices and mannerisms of teachers, family members, and celebrities with a precision that was genuinely remarkable for a child his age. He was obsessed with comedians, watching Richard Pryor and Bill Cosby with intense attention, studying the way they constructed jokes and built relationships with their audiences. Richard Pryor in particular was a transformative influence on Murphy, and he has cited Pryor more times than can be counted as the single greatest comedian he ever witnessed and the person who most shaped his understanding of what comedy could be. By the time he was 15 years old, Murphy was already performing stand-up comedy at local clubs and youth centers. He was performing material that was sophisticated, sharp, and far beyond what anyone expected from a teenager. He was not doing simple jokes. He was constructing full comedic narratives with characters, voices, and a commanding stage presence that made audiences forget how young he was. He was developing at a rate that was genuinely extraordinary. He graduated from Roosevelt Junior-Senior High School and briefly attended Nassau Community College before his career made formal education essentially irrelevant. He had already been developing his comedy obsessively for years, and when the opportunity came to audition for Saturday Night Live in 1980, he was ready. Murphy joined Saturday Night Live as a featured player at the age of 19, making him one of the youngest cast members in the show's history. He had been brought on initially as a backup, with limited airtime, but his talent was so undeniable and his performances so electric that the show quickly gave him more and more space. At a time when the show was struggling with the transition after its original cast had departed, Murphy became its anchor, its most vital creative force, and arguably its salvation. His characters on Saturday Night Live became legendary. He created Buckwheat, a parody of the Our Gang character, Mr. Robinson's Neighborhood, a dark and hilarious parody of Mr. Rogers set in a crumbling urban neighborhood, and Gumby, the clay animation character reimagined as a grumpy and self-important show business veteran. But perhaps his most significant contribution was simply himself, his stand-up comedian persona, raw and sharp and utterly compelling in a way that stopped audiences cold. He left Saturday Night Live in 1984 after 4 seasons to pursue film full-time, and his transition to the big screen was immediate and spectacular. His first major film role was in 48 Hours, released in 1982, in which he starred alongside Nick Nolte as a convict temporarily released to help a detective track down a killer. Murphy had never made a feature film before. He was essentially unknown outside of the SNL audience. And yet his performance was so confident, so funny, and so genuinely compelling as a dramatic presence that he emerged from the film as a full-fledged movie star. Trading Places followed in 1983, another enormous hit, and then came Beverly Hills Cop in 1984, which was a seismic event in the history of American popular cinema. The film grossed over $316 million worldwide, making it the highest-grossing film of 1984 in the United States. Murphy's performance as Axel Foley, a street-smart Detroit detective out of his element in the wealthy neighborhoods of Beverly Hills, was an absolute phenomenon. The character was funny and charming and unexpectedly warm, and audiences everywhere fell completely in love with him. The film launched one of the most successful franchise sequences of the decade, with Beverly Hills Cop 2 following in 1987 and Beverly Hills Cop 3 in 1994. Throughout the 1980s, Murphy was arguably the biggest movie star in the world. He was also releasing stand-up concert films during this period that were equally important to his legacy. Eddie Murphy, Delirious, filmed in 1983, and Eddie Murphy, Raw, filmed in 1987, are both considered landmark achievements in stand-up comedy, performances of such energy and precision and comic invention that they stand among the greatest stand-up concert films ever recorded. Raw in particular, filmed at Madison Square Garden and released theatrically, set box office records for a comedy concert film that stood for many years. His career hit a difficult stretch in the late 1980s and early 1990s. Films like Harlem Nights, Boomerang, and others did not perform as hoped, and critics began to suggest that Murphy had lost his instinct for choosing the right material. But he reinvented himself with tremendous skill. The Nutty Professor in 1996, in which he played multiple roles using elaborate prosthetic makeup, was a massive hit that reminded audiences of his extraordinary range and his willingness to completely transform himself physically and vocally for a performance. Dr. Dolittle followed in 1998 and was another major commercial success. His performance as Donkey in Shrek in 2001 came at exactly the right moment in his career and proved to be one of the most perfect marriages of voice and character in animation history. Murphy improvised freely throughout the recording process, and many of Donkey's most beloved and spontaneous feeling moments are pure Murphy invention. He returned to the role in every Shrek sequel and in the Puss in Boots films, and his portrayal of Donkey is considered by many critics and animation professionals to be one of the greatest voice performances ever committed to film. His personal life has been eventful. He was married to Nicole Mitchell from 1993 until their divorce in 2006. He has a total of 10 children with several different women, and has spoken about the importance of fatherhood in his life with genuine warmth. His relationship with Paige Butcher, an Australian model, has been stable and long-lasting, and they have 2 children together. In 2019, Murphy returned to Saturday Night Live for the first time in 35 years and delivered a monologue that was widely celebrated as a triumphant homecoming. The same year, his dramatic performance in Dolomite Is My Name, in which he played the real-life entertainer and filmmaker Rudy Ray Moore, earned him extraordinary critical praise and reminded the world of the full depth of his talent. Many felt he deserved Academy Award recognition for the performance, and its omission from the nominations list was a point of significant discussion in the film world. He returned to the role of Axel Foley in Beverly Hills Cop, Axel F. in 2024, released on Netflix, which performed extremely well and reminded a new generation of viewers of the character that helped define American action comedy. Cameron Diaz, the voice of Princess Fiona. Cameron Michelle Diaz was born on August 30, 1972, in San Diego, California. She was the second of 2 daughters born to Emilio Diaz, a foreman for an oil company with Cuban heritage, and Billy Early, who was an import and export agent with English, German, and Cherokee ancestry. Growing up in Long Beach, California, Cameron was an athletic, outgoing, an adventurous child who showed from an early age the natural confidence and physical ease that would later define her on screen. Her childhood was sunny and active in the way that California childhoods often are. She was involved in sports and outdoor activities, and she was known among her peers as someone who was naturally funny and naturally at ease in social situations. She attended Long Beach Polytechnic High School, where she was classmates with Snoop Dogg, a fact that has always amused interviewers and that she has confirmed on multiple occasions. She was popular and social, but there was nothing particularly conventional about the path her life was about to take. At the age of 16, she was discovered by a modeling scout at a party and signed with Elite Model Management. This was not a calculated career move orchestrated by ambitious parents. It was an unexpected development that opened a door she had not known was there. She began modeling and was almost immediately successful. She appeared in campaigns for major brands and was featured in publications around the world. By the time she was a young adult, she had already traveled to Japan, Australia, Mexico, Morocco, and Paris for modeling work, experiencing a breadth of the world that most young people her age could only imagine. She had been living this international modeling life for several years when she made the decision to try acting. She had no formal training. She had never taken an acting class. She auditioned for The Mask in 1994 essentially on instinct, walking into the audition as someone who had never done anything like it before, and she won the role opposite Jim Carrey in what became a massive commercial hit. The film grossed over $350 million worldwide, and Diaz, in her first ever acting role, was its breakout star. She was luminous, funny, and effortlessly charming on screen in a way that suggested natural talent of an unusual kind. What followed for most new actors in that position would be a period of careful consolidation, choosing a second role that built sensibly on the first success. Diaz did something rather different. She chose a series of small independent films, deliberately stepping away from the blockbuster machinery to develop herself as an actress rather than simply as a star. She appeared in films like The Last Supper and She's the One, working with directors who pushed her in different ways and playing characters far removed from the glamorous love interests she had played in The Mask. This strategy of alternating between large commercial films and smaller character-driven work would define her career throughout its most successful period. She starred in My Best Friend's Wedding in 1997 opposite Julia Roberts, appearing in a supporting role that was funny and charming and showed a willingness to be second on the call sheet when the role was the right one. She followed this with There's Something About Mary in 1998, the Farrelly Brothers comedy that became one of the most talked about films of the year. Her performance in that film was fearless in a way that not many actresses of her profile would have embraced, committing completely to the physical comedy and the absurdity of the material without vanity or hesitation. It earned her a Golden Globe nomination and cemented her status as one of the most versatile and appealing film stars in Hollywood. Being John Malkovich, also released in 1999, was a completely different kind of challenge. The Charlie Kaufman scripted film was one of the strangest and most original films of its decade, and Diaz played a dowdy, emotionally complicated character that bore no resemblance whatsoever to the glamorous image she had built in her commercial work. She wore unflattering hair and clothes and gave a performance of genuine emotional depth that surprised critics who had perhaps not been paying close enough attention to what she had been doing with her choices all along. Charlie's Angels in 2000 and its sequel Charlie's Angels, Full Throttle in 2003 were enormous commercial successes that showcased her physical ability and her gift for light comedy alongside Drew Barrymore and Lucy Liu. Vanilla Sky in 2001 with Tom Cruise, Gangs of New York in 2002 with Leonardo DiCaprio and directed by Martin Scorsese, and In Her Shoes in 2005 all demonstrated the range she had built across her career. Her work as Princess Fiona in Shrek extended across all 4 films in the main franchise, and she brought to Fiona something that the character absolutely required, which was genuine warmth and humor balanced with real emotional vulnerability. Fiona could have been a straightforward parody of a fairy tale princess, but in Diaz's hands she became a complete person whose complicated relationship with her own identity felt genuinely moving. Her personal life has been the subject of enormous public interest over the years, partly because she was one of the most famous women in the world during the peak of her career and partly because she was involved with several high-profile figures. She dated Matt Dillon, Jared Leto, and Justin Timberlake at various points, and the latter relationship in particular attracted a great deal of media attention. In 2015, she married guitarist Benji Madden of the band Good Charlotte, and by all accounts the relationship has been a grounding and genuinely happy one for her. In 2018, she announced that she was retiring from acting, citing a desire for a quieter life and the exhaustion of decades of intense public work. She has spoken thoughtfully about the decision, explaining that she wanted to redirect her energy inward and toward her personal life after so many years of giving everything outward. She and Benji Madden welcomed a daughter named Radix in 2019, and her retirement seemed complete and genuine. However, in 2022 she came out of retirement to star in Back in Action, an action comedy opposite Jamie Foxx produced by Netflix. The film was released in 2025 and marked her return to screens after a 7-year absence, demonstrating that retirement in Hollywood is rarely quite as permanent as it initially appears. John Lithgow, the voice of Lord Farquaad. John Arthur Lithgow was born on October 19, 1945, in Rochester, New York. He was born into a family where the arts were not a peripheral interest, but the absolute center of everything. His father, Arthur Washington Lithgow, was a theatrical producer and director who spent his career dedicated to bringing classical theater to audiences across the United States, particularly through touring productions of Shakespeare. His mother, Sarah Jane Price, was an actress. The household that John grew up in was shaped entirely by theater, by literature, by performance, and by the belief that the arts were essential rather than optional. He grew up moving around considerably because his father's theatrical work took the family to various locations. He spent time in Yellow Springs, Ohio, where his father was associated with Antioch Shakespeare Festival, and the exposure to serious theatrical production from an extremely young age gave John a relationship with performance that was rooted in something much deeper than most actors ever develop. He was not watching theater from the outside. He was growing up inside it, absorbing its rhythms and its demands and its possibilities as naturally as other children absorb the rhythms of school or sport. He attended Harvard University, where he studied English literature and graduated magna cum laude in 1967. His academic achievement was genuine and substantial, and his time at Harvard deepened the intellectual framework that has always been evident in his work. He was not simply a performer. He was a thinking performer, someone who approached every role with the kind of analytical intelligence that his education had sharpened. He was involved in theater at Harvard and received a Fulbright scholarship to study at the London Academy of Music and Dramatic Art, commonly known as LAMDA, which is one of the most respected drama schools in the world. His training at LAMDA gave him technical foundations that, combined with his natural intelligence and his lifetime of exposure to serious theatrical work, made him an extraordinarily skilled actor before he had even begun his professional career in earnest. He returned to the United States and began working in theater in New York, establishing himself as a stage actor of considerable power and range before most people outside theater circles had ever heard of him. His Broadway career is one of the most distinguished in American theatrical history. He won Tony Awards for his performances in The Changing Room in 1973, The Magistrate in 1980, Requiem for a Dream, and other productions that demonstrated a range and a depth that few actors of any era could match. On stage he has played everything from classical tragedy to absurdist comedy, from dramatic leads to character roles, with consistent excellence. The stage has always been his foundation, the place where his abilities are most completely expressed, and he has returned to it throughout his career regardless of whatever was happening in his film and television work. His film career began in earnest in the early 1980s and quickly established him as one of the most valuable character actors in American cinema. His performance as a villain in Blowout in 1981 showed a capacity for darkness and menace that was genuinely startling. His role in The World According to Garp in 1982, in which he played Roberta Muldoon, a former professional football player who becomes a woman, was a performance of such humanity, warmth, and lack of self-consciousness that it earned him his first Academy Award nomination for Best Supporting Actor. Subsequent nominations followed with remarkable speed. Terms of Endearment in 1983, in which he played a charming and irresponsible astronaut, earned him a second Academy Award nomination and a Golden Globe win. He was nominated for Best Actor for The Wrong Man, and his career as a serious dramatic film performer was completely secure. He has the unusual distinction of being nominated for Academy Awards in both the Best Supporting Actor and Best Actor categories across different films, which speaks to the breadth and consistency of his work. His television work has been equally extraordinary. He played Dick Solomon, the self-important alien experiencing human life for the first time, in Third Rock from the Sun, the NBC comedy series that ran from 1996 to 2001. The performance earned him 4 Primetime Emmy Awards and 3 Golden Globe Awards, making the show one of the most decorated periods of his career. That he was able to commit so completely to a broadly comedic performance while maintaining his stature as a serious dramatic actor says everything about his range. His more recent television work has been, if anything, even more acclaimed. His portrayal of Arthur Mitchell, the Trinity Killer, in the 4th season of Dexter in 2009 is widely considered one of the greatest villain performances in the history of American television drama. He won an Emmy, a Golden Globe, and a Screen Actors Guild Award for the performance, and many critics consider the 4th season of Dexter, built around Lithgow's character, to be among the finest single seasons of television drama ever produced. His performance as Winston Churchill in The Crown, opposite Claire Foy's Queen Elizabeth II, in 2016 earned him yet another Emmy Award and demonstrated once again that his ability to transform himself into real historical figures while maintaining emotional truth is essentially without parallel. His voice work as Lord Farquaad in Shrek is a smaller part of his overall legacy but is an excellent example of his instinct for finding the precise comic register that a character requires. Farquaad is absurd and petty and ridiculous, but Lithgow plays him with complete conviction, which is exactly what makes him funny. A lesser actor playing Farquaad as a joke would have deflated every scene. Lithgow plays him as though he is entirely serious about his own importance, and the gap between his grandiosity and his actual smallness, in every sense, is where all the comedy lives. His personal life has been one of long and stable commitment. He was married to Jean Tainton from 1969 to 1981, and they have 2 children together. He married Mary Yeager, a historian and academic at UCLA, in 1981, and they have 1 child together. The marriage has been lasting and clearly a source of genuine happiness and stability in his life. He has spoken warmly about his wife and their life together on many occasions. Beyond his acting work, Lithgow has written and published several children's books, illustrated by various artists, that have been warmly received. He is also a published author of poetry. These ventures are not celebrity side projects undertaken for additional attention but genuine expressions of a creative and intellectual life that extends in multiple directions. He is, in the truest sense, a man of letters as well as a man of the stage and screen, someone whose engagement with storytelling is deep enough to find expression in whatever form suits the material best. John Lithgow remains, as of this writing, one of the most consistently excellent and genuinely versatile actors in the history of American performance, with a career spanning more than 5 decades that shows no sign of diminishing in quality or ambition. If you have made it this far through the complete life histories of the 4 actors who gave voice to the world of Shrek, then you already know why this film feels the way it does. It takes real artists with real depth and real stories behind them to create something that lasts. And every one of these 4 people brought a lifetime of experience, struggle, training, and genuine human feeling to the recording booth. That is why Shrek is not just a cartoon. That is why it is a classic. Shrek, 2001, budget, making of, and funny moments behind the scenes. The budget and financial foundation. Shrek was produced on an official budget of approximately $60 million, which at the time of its production was considered a substantial but not extraordinary sum for a major animated feature from a studio of DreamWorks ambition and scale. To put that number in proper context, Disney's animated films during that era were regularly being produced at similar or even higher budgets, and the competition between the 2 studios was intense, deliberate, and very much on the minds of everyone involved in making Shrek from the very first day of production. What made the $60 million figure particularly significant was what the studio was attempting to do with it. DreamWorks was not making a traditionally animated film with hand-drawn characters and painted backgrounds. They were making a fully computer-generated film with an extraordinary level of visual detail, and the technology required to achieve what they were attempting was pushing the absolute boundaries of what was possible in 2001. Every single blade of grass in the meadow sequences, every strand of hair on Fiona's head, every ripple in the swamp water, and every texture on Shrek's green skin required an enormous amount of computational power and artistic labor. The $60 million budget was being stretched in directions that a live-action film of the same budget simply would never have to consider. The film eventually grossed over $484 million worldwide at the box office, making it one of the highest-grossing films of 2001 and delivering DreamWorks a return on investment that was genuinely remarkable. But beyond the theatrical gross, the home video sales, the merchandise, the theme park deals, and the franchise value that Shrek created for DreamWorks over the years that followed pushed the total value generated by the original film into territory that made the $60 million production cost look almost laughably modest in retrospect. Shrek essentially became the financial backbone of DreamWorks Animation for the better part of a decade. The long and complicated road to making Shrek. The story of how Shrek came to be made is itself a fascinating piece of Hollywood history that goes back much further than most people realize. The rights to William Steig's original 1990 picture book were purchased by Steven Spielberg very shortly after the book was published. Spielberg saw something in the material immediately and wanted it developed, but the project sat in development for years without finding the right form or the right creative team to bring it to life. The project took on an entirely different dimension when Jeffrey Katzenberg became deeply personally invested in it. Katzenberg had a complicated and painful history with Disney, where he had worked as chairman of the studio's film division and had been responsible for overseeing the Disney Renaissance of the late 1980s and early 1990s, the period that produced The Little Mermaid, Beauty and the Beast, Aladdin, and The Lion King. His departure from Disney in 1994 after being passed over for a promotion he believed he had been promised was not amicable, and the legal and personal fallout from that departure shaped his relationship with the project he was now developing at the studio he had co-founded with Spielberg and David Geffen. Katzenberg wanted Shrek to be a direct response to Disney, a film that would challenge and satirize the very conventions that Disney had built its empire upon. He wanted to make a fairy tale that said everything Disney would never say, that showed the princess as something other than a passive beauty waiting for rescue, that made the hero ugly and difficult and real, and that took the sanitized perfection of the Disney fairy tale world and replaced it with something messier and more honest, and ultimately more human. This ambition drove every creative decision throughout the production. The film went through a significant number of creative iterations before arriving at the version audiences eventually saw. Early in the development process, the film was being considered as a more traditionally comedic production, closer to a straight parody without the genuine emotional depth that defines the finished film. Writers and directors came and went as the project searched for its proper shape. The decision to make Shrek a CGI film rather than a traditionally animated one was itself a major turning point, one that required DreamWorks to build up its technological capabilities at enormous expense and effort before a single frame of the actual film could be rendered. The directors Andrew Adamson and Vicki Jensen were eventually brought in to lead the project, and their vision for the film was the one that ultimately shaped everything. Adamson in particular had strong ideas about the emotional core of the story, insisting that underneath all the humor and the fairy tale satire there needed to be a genuinely moving story about belonging and self-acceptance. He pushed the creative team to make sure that every joke served the characters rather than existing purely for its own sake, and this discipline is a significant reason why the film works as well as it does. The technology that made it all possible. The technological achievement behind Shrek was genuinely staggering for its time and deserves to be understood properly to appreciate what the production team accomplished. The film was made using proprietary software developed specifically by the technical team at Pacific Data Images, which was the computer animation studio that DreamWorks had acquired to produce its CGI films. The software and rendering techniques developed for Shrek pushed beyond anything that had previously been attempted in feature film animation. The most significant challenge was human skin. Specifically, Princess Fiona's human skin. Prior to Shrek, CGI films had largely avoided the problem of rendering realistic human skin because the technology simply was not capable of doing it convincingly. Human beings are extraordinarily sensitive to subtle imperfections and representations of other human beings, a phenomenon that scientists and animators refer to as the uncanny valley. When a human representation looks almost but not quite right, it triggers an immediate and powerful sense of wrongness in the viewer. The PDI team had to develop entirely new techniques for rendering the way light passes through and bounces off human skin, creating what they called subsurface scattering effects, in order to make Fiona look like a person rather than a plastic doll. The work on Shrek's own skin was technically different but equally complex. The texture of his green face, the pores, the subtle variations in color and surface quality, all of it required painstaking individual attention. The same applied to the fur and hair that appeared on various characters and creatures throughout the film. Each strand of hair had to be individually simulated, and the computational cost of rendering those simulations was enormous. The production team sometimes had to wait days for a single complex shot to finish rendering on the available hardware. The natural environments in the film were also a major technological undertaking. The swamp sequences required realistic water simulation, realistic mud behavior, and realistic vegetation that moved naturally in response to characters moving through it. The meadow scenes required convincing grass and trees and sunlight effects. Every environment was essentially a new technical problem that required a new technical solution, and the team solved each one with a combination of brilliance and sheer hard work. The total number of people who worked on the film was in the hundreds, spread across the creative, technical, and administrative teams. The production was a massive undertaking by any measure, and the fact that it came together as cohesively and beautifully as it did is a testament to the organizational skill of the producers as much as the creative talent of the artists and technicians involved. Mike Myers and the $5 million decision. One of the most remarkable and widely discussed stories from the making of Shrek involves Mike Myers and the decision to completely re-record his performance in a Scottish accent after he had already completed a significant portion of the recording work in his natural North American voice. This decision, which Myers proposed himself after already having recorded large amounts of dialogue, cost DreamWorks approximately $5 million in additional production work, because changing the voice of the main character at that stage of production required adjustments far beyond simply re-recording the audio. The animators had been working from the original recording sessions, timing Shrek's mouth movements, facial expressions, and physical performance to the rhythms and cadences of Myers' North American accent. When Myers proposed switching to the Scottish accent, it was not simply a matter of going back into the recording booth and reading the same lines differently. A Scottish accent places emphasis on different syllables, has different rhythms, holds words for different lengths of time, and breathes in different places than a North American accent. All of that means that the animation work that had already been done using the original recordings needed to be revisited, adjusted, and in many cases entirely redone. Myers' reasoning for the change was rooted in his understanding of character and class. He felt that Shrek was fundamentally a working-class character, someone who was rough and unpretentious and proud in the way that working-class people often are, and that the Scottish accent, specifically the kind of blunt, no-nonsense Edinburgh working-class inflection he had heard around his family all his life, captured that quality in a way that his North American voice simply did not. He believed the accent would give Shrek specificity and authenticity, making him feel like a real person from somewhere rather than a generic animated character speaking in a generic animated voice. DreamWorks, to their enormous credit, trusted Meyer's instinct and absorbed the cost. The result proved him completely right. The Scottish accent is inseparable from Shrek as a character. It is impossible now to imagine him sounding any other way, and the decision that seemed extravagant and potentially reckless at the time turned out to be one of the most important creative choices made during the entire production. Eddie Murphy in the recording booth. The recording sessions with Eddie Murphy were, by all accounts from those who were present, an experience unlike anything else that happened during the making of the film. Murphy approaches voice acting the way he approaches stand-up comedy, and the way he approaches virtually everything else in his career, which is to say with enormous energy, relentless creativity, and a complete willingness to throw out the script and try something completely different if a better idea occurs to him in the moment. The directors and producers who supervised Murphy's sessions have described them in interviews as genuinely exhilarating but also somewhat unpredictable. Murphy would record the scripted lines as written, which were already good, and then immediately suggest alternatives. He would try the line 10 different ways without being asked. He would respond to Donkey's situation from a place of such genuine comedic instinct that things came out of his mouth that nobody in the room had anticipated and that were often funnier than what had been written for him. Many of Donkey's most beloved lines and moments in the finished film are pure Murphy improvisations that happened in the recording booth, and were simply too good to leave out. The rhythm of certain Donkey speeches, the way he accelerates into a sentence, and then changes direction halfway through, the timing of a pause before a particularly absurd observation, all of that is Murphy's natural comedic instinct expressing itself in the moment rather than anything that was pre-planned or scripted. The sessions could run long because once Murphy was in the flow of something, nobody wanted to stop him. He would keep going, keep trying new things, keep discovering new corners of the character, and the people in the recording booth would be trying to maintain their professional composure while genuinely cracking up at what was coming through the microphone. It was one of those situations where everyone in the room understood they were witnessing something special, even if they could not quite articulate what made it so exceptional in the moment. There is a particularly well-known story from the production about the recording of the scene in which Donkey first sees the dragon and begins desperately complimenting her to avoid being eaten. Murphy was given the scripted lines as a starting point, and then essentially riffed his way through the sequence with such natural fluency, and such perfectly calibrated escalating panic that the directors were laughing too hard to call cut. The session for that particular sequence went on for a very long time, not because Murphy was struggling but because he kept coming up with new variations that were each funnier than the last, and nobody wanted to be the person who stopped him. Cameron Diaz and her unexpected preparation. Cameron Diaz had virtually no experience with voice acting before taking on the role of Princess Fiona, and she has spoken about the adjustment process honestly in interviews. Acting for animation is a fundamentally different skill set from on-camera acting in ways that are not immediately obvious to people who have not tried it. When you are performing on camera, your body, your face, your eyes, your physical presence in space, all of it is working together to create the performance. The audience sees you entirely. When you are in a recording booth doing voice work for animation, all of that is gone. You have only your voice, and you have to somehow put the totality of the character's physical and emotional life into the sounds you make. Diaz found this genuinely challenging at first. She is a physically expressive performer by nature, someone who uses her body and her face with tremendous fluency, and being reduced to a microphone and a script and a pair of headphones in a small room felt limiting in ways she had not anticipated. She worked with the directors to find ways to stay physically engaged during the recording sessions, moving around the booth, gesturing even though nobody could see her, doing things with her body to keep the energy alive in her voice. The recordings for Fiona's more physical sequences, the fighting scenes and the moments of running and jumping, required Diaz to physically exert herself in the booth to get the breath and the energy right. She would actually be moving during these recordings, her voice capturing the genuine physical effort rather than a simulation of it. This approach, which sounds slightly absurd when described, actually produces noticeably more authentic results in the finished animation, because the voice sounds like it belongs to a body doing the thing that the animated character is doing on screen. The funny incidents and lighter moments of production. While the technical side of Shrek's production was an enormous and largely serious undertaking, the human beings involved in making it were not always serious, and the process generated numerous stories of genuine humor and unexpected levity. The writing team, which included Ted Elliott and Terry Rossio among others, had sessions during which the attempt to pack fairy tale references and satirical jokes into every corner of the film led to genuinely absurd conversations. The writers would spend hours debating the internal logic of the fairy tale world they were creating, asking questions like whether the three blind mice would still bump into things if they were in an animated universe, or exactly how Pinocchio's nose would work if he told a lie about what kind of lie he was telling. These conversations were ostensibly serious creative discussions but inevitably became exercises in increasingly elaborate absurdism that had the room in helpless laughter. The recording sessions between Mike Myers and Eddie Murphy, while they were never done together in the same room because voice actors for animated films typically record separately, did occasionally overlap in the studio schedule. The people who worked on both sets of sessions have noted the complete contrast in approach. Myers would come in extremely prepared, with a very clear idea of exactly what he wanted to try and very specific technical intentions for each line. Murphy would come in ready to throw all of that out and discover the character in real time through improvisation. The fact that these two completely opposite approaches somehow produced a chemistry on screen that feels completely natural and completely believable is one of the stranger miracles of the film's production. The technical team had their own collection of amusing moments that arose from the novelty of what they were doing. Because the software they were using to render the film was in many cases being developed simultaneously with the film itself, things would occasionally break in unexpected ways. There are stories of entire sequences rendering incorrectly overnight, producing images that bore no resemblance to what had been intended but that were sometimes accidentally hilarious. Shrek's skin turning unexpected colors, characters' faces deforming in ways that looked absolutely nothing like the intended expressions, grass and water behaving in ways that defied the physics they were supposed to simulate. All of these glitches produced moments of collective bewilderment that would eventually become funny once the problem was identified and solved. There is a particularly beloved story from the animation team about the early tests for the dragon character. Getting the dragon's movement right required extensive simulation of how an enormous winged creature would move through air, and the early tests were frequently not quite right in ways that produced movement that looked simultaneously terrifying and deeply funny. There were versions of the dragon that moved with a strange, bouncing quality that made her look less like a fearsome creature and more like an enormous and very enthusiastic puppy. These versions were never intended for the finished film, but they circulated among the production team and were a reliable source of entertainment during the long and exhausting production period. The sequence in which Donkey tries to convince the dragon of his attractiveness was a source of considerable amusement throughout production, not just because of Murphy's recording session but because the animators working on the dragon's expressions during that sequence had to figure out how to make a massive fire-breathing creature look genuinely smitten and charmed. The process of developing those expressions involved the animators trying various versions and sharing them with colleagues for feedback, and the early drafts of a lovesick dragon apparently produced reactions ranging from genuine appreciation to uncontrollable laughter depending on how successfully or unsuccessfully the expression had landed. John Lithgow's recording sessions for Lord Farquaad were apparently notable for the contrast between the complete seriousness with which Lithgow approached the work and the inherent ridiculousness of what he was doing. Lithgow is an enormously serious and technically precise actor, and he brought that same precision to Farquaad, recording each line with full commitment to the character's grandiosity and wounded pride. The people in the booth have noted that watching someone of Lithgow's theatrical stature performing the lines of a tiny, cartoonishly vain, and ultimately very stupid villain with complete sincerity was an experience that required considerable self-control to observe without laughing visibly and breaking his concentration. There were also numerous moments during production where the writers and directors, deep in the process of crafting their satirical fairy tale world, would accidentally create something so absurd that it took on a life of its own in the room. The Duloc welcome sequence, in which tiny mechanical puppet figures sing a cheerful song about the kingdom's perfection, was one of those ideas that started as a fairly simple satirical concept and then escalated in the writing process to a level of strangeness that had everyone involved oscillating between wondering if it had gone too far and deciding it had not gone nearly far enough. The decision to include a significant number of contemporary popular songs on the soundtrack rather than original musical compositions was also a source of considerable debate and occasional humor during production. Finding songs that worked for specific scenes required listening to enormous quantities of music and having conversations about why a particular song did or did not work for a particular moment, that were sometimes genuinely hilarious in their earnestness. Debating whether a specific pop song accurately captured the emotional truth of an ogre falling in love is the kind of conversation that sounds absurd in retrospect but felt completely urgent and important to the people having it at the time. The overall atmosphere on the production, by the accounts of those who were there, was one of genuine creative excitement mixed with the exhaustion and occasional frustration that any massively ambitious project inevitably generates. The people making Shrek knew they were doing something unusual and potentially very special, but they also knew they were pushing against the limits of what was technically possible at that moment in the history of computer animation, and that combination of excitement and pressure created an environment that was intense and funny and occasionally chaotic in roughly equal measure. What came out of all of that effort? All of those late nights and technical failures and improvised recording sessions and arguing about fairy tale logic and rendering dragon expressions and Mike Myers' $5 million Scottish accent, was a film that changed everything. And knowing all of that makes watching it a slightly different and considerably richer experience. Shrek, 2001, Cultural and Historical Details. The historical moment that made Shrek possible. To truly understand what Shrek meant when it arrived in 2001, you have to understand the world it arrived into, both the world of cinema and the broader cultural world that surrounded it. The year 2001 was a particular kind of moment in American and global culture, a moment balanced between the optimism and technological enthusiasm of the late 1990s and the deep uncertainty and grief that the events of September would bring later that same year. Shrek was released in May of 2001, in the spring, before the world changed, and it landed in a culture that was ready and hungry for something that felt genuinely subversive and genuinely funny in equal measure. The 1990s had been a decade of extraordinary dominance for Disney in the field of animated film. The Disney Renaissance, which began with The Little Mermaid in 1989 and extended through films like Beauty and the Beast, Aladdin, The Lion King, Pocahontas, The Hunchback of Notre Dame, Hercules, and Mulan, had essentially redefined what mainstream audiences expected from animated feature films. These films were gorgeous, they were emotionally powerful, they had brilliant music written by composers like Alan Menken and songs performed by major artists, and they told stories drawn from fairy tales, myths, and legends with a particular Disney house style that emphasized romantic heroism, clear moral lessons, and resolutions that restored order and beauty to the world. That style was enormously successful commercially and often genuinely excellent artistically. But by the end of the 1990s, it had also become a formula that was beginning to feel somewhat rigid, somewhat predictable, and somewhat disconnected from the more complicated and ironic sensibility that was increasingly shaping popular culture. The late 1990s were a culturally self-aware and sardonic period in many respects. Television was producing shows that were deeply knowing about their own conventions, like The Simpsons and Seinfeld. Comedy was moving toward a kind of meta-awareness, and understanding that audiences knew the tricks and could appreciate humor that acknowledged that. Into this cultural moment came Shrek, which took the Disney fairy tale formula and subjected it to exactly the kind of knowing, irreverent, and affectionate demolition that the cultural moment was ready to appreciate. The Disney War and what it really meant. The rivalry between DreamWorks and Disney that shaped the creation of Shrek was not simply a business competition between two studios. It was a genuine ideological disagreement about what animated film could and should be, and it was driven to a significant degree by personal history and personal pain that gave it an emotional intensity unusual in the relatively bloodless world of corporate entertainment competition. Jeffrey Katzenberg had been one of the most powerful executives in Hollywood during his time at Disney. He had championed the animated projects that defined the Disney Renaissance, and had been deeply involved in their development and success. When Michael Eisner, the head of Disney, passed him over for a promotion he had been led to expect, Katzenberg's departure from the company was bitter and public and followed by a lawsuit that Disney eventually settled for an amount reported to be in the hundreds of millions of dollars. Katzenberg went to DreamWorks and immediately set about building an animation division that could challenge and ultimately surpass what Disney had achieved. He was not subtle about this ambition. He spoke openly about wanting to beat Disney, and the choices he made in developing Shrek reflected this ambition at every level. The film was deliberately designed to be everything the Disney fairy tale was not. Where Disney princesses were passive and beautiful and waited for their prince, Fiona was active, funny, physically capable, and ultimately transformed not into the perfect beauty but into the thing society would least expect. Where Disney heroes were handsome and noble, Shrek was green and enormous, and socially impossible. Where Disney villains were dramatically dark and imposing, Lord Farquaad was pathetically small in every sense, a parody of authoritarian vanity rather than a genuine source of menace. The film is also full of direct visual and narrative references to Disney that function as gentle mockery. The design of Duloc, Farquaad's kingdom, is clearly modeled on the visual language of Disneyland itself, with its immaculate cleanliness, its uniformity, its cheerful performative welcoming figures, and its sense of a world designed as a product rather than as a place where people actually live. The welcome song that plays when Shrek and Donkey first arrive in Duloc is a pitch-perfect parody of the kind of manufactured cheerfulness that Katzenberg associated with the Disney brand. The whole sequence is essentially a visual essay on the difference between authentic and performed happiness, and it is aimed with considerable precision at a very specific target. Historically, this rivalry between two major entertainment studios producing competing visions of the same cultural form, the fairy tale animated feature, produced an unusually rich period for the art form itself. Competition pushed both studios to try harder, take more risks, and develop their ideas more fully than they might have done without the pressure of a genuine and formidable rival. The audience was the ultimate beneficiary of this corporate and personal conflict. Fairy tales, their history, and what Shrek did to them. To understand the cultural significance of what Shrek did to the fairy tale, you need to understand what the fairy tale has been throughout the history of Western culture, and how it has changed over the centuries. The fairy tale is one of the oldest forms of narrative in human civilization, and its history is considerably darker and more complicated than the sanitized versions that most people are familiar with through Disney and other modern adaptations. The stories that we know as fairy tales, Cinderella, Snow White, Sleeping Beauty, Rapunzel, Hansel and Gretel, and all the others, have their roots in oral folk traditions that existed long before anyone wrote them down. These stories were told by ordinary people to other ordinary people, often in the context of adult life rather than childhood, and they dealt with the fears and desires and social realities of the communities that produced them. They were stories about hunger and poverty and danger and death as much as they were about magic and transformation. They were stories about the brutal unfairness of a social hierarchy in which ordinary people had very little power and were entirely at the mercy of the powerful. They used fantasy and magic as ways of processing real and often terrifying experiences. The German scholars Jacob and Wilhelm Grimm collected and published a large number of these traditional stories in the early 19th century, and their collections brought fairy tales to a much wider literate audience. But even the Grimm versions, which have a reputation for darkness, were themselves a kind of sanitization of even older and rawer material. The versions of these stories that existed in oral tradition before the Grimm brothers wrote them down were often significantly more violent, more sexual, and more uncompromising in their depiction of cruelty and suffering. The Disney version of the fairy tale, which began with Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs in 1937, took this already multi-layered tradition and processed it through the specific cultural filters of 20th century American optimism, corporate entertainment values, and a particular vision of gender and romance that reflected the social norms of the times in which these films were made. Disney fairy tales are beautiful and often genuinely moving, but they consistently make choices that smooth away the complexity and darkness of the source material in favor of clarity, optimism, and a vision of romantic love as a transformative and redemptive force that fixes everything. Shrek arrived and did something that was both radical and deeply connected to the original spirit of the folk tale tradition. It put complexity back into the fairy tale. It made its heroes socially marginalized and ugly by conventional standards. It made its princess complicated and capable and hiding a secret that complicated her relationship to the idea of beauty and perfection. It made its villain small and petty and recognizably human in his insecurities rather than grandly evil. And it suggested that the happy ending did not look like the pictures in the book but like something messier and more honest, and ultimately more real. In doing this, Shrek was not departing from the fairy tale tradition so much as it was returning to something closer to its original complexity, filtered through a modern and culturally knowing sensibility. The cultural politics of beauty and the outsider. One of the most significant cultural contributions that Shrek made was its treatment of beauty, ugliness, and the social experience of being an outsider. This theme was not incidental to the film but was absolutely central to it, and it resonated with audiences across different ages, backgrounds, and life experiences in ways that clearly went beyond simple entertainment. Shrek is, at its cultural core, a story about what it feels like to be the person that society has decided does not belong. He has been defined by others as a monster before he has had any opportunity to define himself, and he has responded to that definition by accepting its terms and retreating from the world entirely. His decision to live alone in a swamp is not simply a personality quirk. It is the logical conclusion of a lifetime of being told that his existence is unwelcome. He has internalized the rejection so completely that he now volunteers for his own exclusion, building walls before anyone else can build them for him. This experience, of being so thoroughly defined by others' negative perceptions that you begin to organize your entire life around avoiding the pain of rejection, is not a fantastical or unusual experience. It is something that a very large number of people understand from the inside. Children who are bullied, people who are discriminated against on the basis of their appearance, or their race, or their sexuality, or any other characteristic that marks them as different from a dominant norm, adults who have been told so many times that they do not fit that they have stopped trying to fit anywhere. All of these people recognize something of their own experience in Shrek's swamp, in the walls he had built, and in the careful and painful process of letting someone in. Fiona's parallel experience added another dimension to this cultural resonance. Her secret, the ogre form she transforms into every night, functioned in the film as a metaphor for the experience of having an aspect of yourself that you believe is so fundamentally unacceptable that it must be kept hidden at all costs. The shame she carries about her ogre form is completely disconnected from any actual wrongness in that form. There is nothing wrong with being an ogre. The wrongness exists entirely in the cultural value system that has told her since childhood that beauty, and specifically a particular kind of conventional feminine beauty, is her most important attribute, and the thing upon which her value as a person depends. The film's resolution, in which the breaking of the curse does not restore Fiona to her human form but makes her permanently the thing she has been most ashamed of, was a genuinely radical statement for a mainstream animated film aimed at a family audience. The message was explicit and unmistakable. Your true form is not the one that meets society's expectations of beauty. Your true form is the one that your truest self inhabits. And that form is not only acceptable but beautiful to the person who truly loves you. For a major Hollywood film in 2001 to say this clearly and without qualification, and to say it through the visual language of animation, which has traditionally been one of the most conservative and convention-bound of all narrative art forms in its treatment of beauty and ugliness, was culturally significant in a way that went beyond entertainment. The working class hero and social class in Shrek. Shrek is also, though this aspect of the film is less frequently discussed, a story about social class. The character of Shrek is unmistakably coded as working class in a way that is not accidental. His Scottish accent, which Mike Myers deliberately chose for its working class Edinburgh associations, his blunt manner of speaking, his simple tastes, his relationship with his physical environment, his distrust of institutions and authority. All of these are cultural markers that place him in a specific social position relative to the aristocratic and institutional power represented by Lord Farquaad and the conventional fairy tale world. Lord Farquaad's obsession with order, purity, and the expulsion of anything that does not conform to his standards is recognizable as a particular kind of elite anxiety about the lower orders, a desire to create a space that is clean and beautiful and populated only by the right kind of people. His treatment of the fairy tale creatures as pollutants to be removed from his perfect kingdom is a fairy tale version of the kind of social cleansing that powerful people and institutions have practiced throughout human history. He does not hate the fairy tale creatures because they have done anything wrong. He hates them because they are disorderly and impure and because their existence complicates the perfect image he is trying to project. Shrek's victory over Farquaad is therefore not just a personal triumph. It is a cultural and class statement. The working class outsider, the creature that polite society would rather not look at, defeats the petty aristocrat through the sheer force of his genuine humanity. This is a story that has deep roots in folktale traditions across many cultures. The idea that the person society dismisses and excludes often turns out to be the one with the most genuine worth. Shrek was not the first story to tell it, but it told it in a way that was enormously accessible to a global audience, and gave it the full weight of a major Hollywood production. Popular music as cultural language. The decision to use popular contemporary music throughout Shrek rather than original show tunes or orchestral score was itself a significant cultural statement, and a marker of the specific historical moment in which the film was made. The soundtrack included songs by Smash Mouth, Eddie Murphy himself, Joan Jett, The Proclaimers, and others, and the choice to root the film's emotional moments in the landscape of contemporary pop and rock music rather than in the more timeless and classical musical language of the Disney musical had a specific cultural effect. It told the audience that this was their world, not the world of Once Upon a Time. The music connected the fairy tale setting to the present tense in a way that was both funny and genuinely effective emotionally. When a contemporary pop song plays over a scene of a green ogre walking through a muddy swamp, the contrast is inherently comic. But when the same pop song plays over a scene of that ogre beginning to fall in love, the contemporary cultural associations of the song bring a warmth and a familiarity that the scene might not have achieved with a more conventional musical approach. The use of Smash Mouth's All-Star over the opening sequence became one of the most recognizable musical moments in animated film history and later in internet culture history. The song, which was a moderate hit before Shrek used it, became permanently associated with the film and with a particular era of early 2000s popular culture that the film both represented and helped define. This approach to soundtrack curation, using existing popular songs rather than original compositions to underscore key emotional moments, was not entirely new in film but was relatively novel in animated features and has been widely imitated in the decades since Shrek pioneered it so successfully. The birth of the Oscar for Best Animated Feature. Shrek holds a specific and permanent place in the historical record of cinema because it was the recipient of the first ever Academy Award for Best Animated Feature Film. This category had not existed before 2002, when the Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences introduced it specifically to recognize a form of filmmaking that had grown sophisticated enough and commercially significant enough to deserve its own dedicated recognition at the most prestigious award ceremony in the film industry. The introduction of the category was itself a historical event of considerable significance. For most of the history of cinema, animated films had been treated as a secondary or lesser form by the Academy and by much of the critical establishment. They were appreciated, sometimes even loved, but they were not generally considered in the same category as live-action dramatic films when it came to the most serious awards recognition. A handful of animated films had received special honorary Oscars over the years, but they were never truly competing on the same terms as live-action work. The introduction of the Best Animated Feature category acknowledged that animation had evolved into a form capable of the same range of artistic and emotional achievement as any other kind of filmmaking, while also, somewhat controversially, essentially ensuring that animated films would compete primarily against each other rather than against live-action films for the major prizes. This has remained a point of debate in the years since, with some arguing that animated films should be eligible for Best Picture on the same terms as any other film and that the separate category, however well-intentioned, actually reinforces the secondariness it was meant to address. Shrek winning the first ever award in this category gave the film a historical significance that went beyond its own considerable artistic and commercial achievements. It became the founding document of an official cultural recognition that animated film was a serious art form worthy of the same institutional respect as any other. Shrek and the Internet, an unexpected cultural legacy. Perhaps the most surprising and genuinely unprecedented aspect of Shrek's cultural legacy is what happened to it on the Internet over the decade that followed its release. The film, which was already enormously culturally significant by any conventional measure, took on an entirely second life in Internet culture that transformed it from a beloved mainstream animated film into something altogether stranger and more interesting, a kind of Internet folk hero whose meaning and significance expanded far beyond anything its creators had intended. The phenomenon began gradually, and then all at once. Internet communities, particularly younger users on platforms like YouTube, Tumblr, Reddit, and eventually Twitter and other social media, began using Shrek as a vehicle for humor that was deliberately absurdist and deliberately excessive. Shrek became the subject of countless fan edits, parody videos, and memes that played with the film's imagery in increasingly surreal ways. The expression Shrek is love, Shrek is life became a kind of internet mantra, used with ironic intensity to express a devotion to the character that was simultaneously completely genuine and completely absurd. This internet reimagining of Shrek is culturally interesting for a number of reasons. It represents a form of participatory culture in which audiences do not simply consume a cultural product but take ownership of it, transform it, and generate new meanings from it that the original creators never intended. The Shrek of internet culture is not quite the same Shrek that Andrew Adamson and Vicky Jensen made. He has been processed through the ironic and deeply strange sensibility of internet humor, and emerged as something that belongs as much to the communities that remixed him as to the studio that created him. This process of cultural appropriation and transformation is not new. It has happened to folk tales and myths and songs and stories throughout human history. What was new about what happened to Shrek was the speed and scale at which it happened, enabled by digital technology and the participatory architecture of the Internet. Shrek became a case study in how a piece of mass culture can be simultaneously consumed and reinvented by its audience, and the result was a cultural presence that no studio marketing campaign could have predicted or manufactured. what Shrek meant for representation in animated film. It would be an overstatement to claim that Shrek single-handedly revolutionized representation in animated film, because the changes in how animated films treat their characters have been the result of many different influences across many years. But it would also be an understatement to ignore the ways in which Shrek moved the needle on certain specific questions about who gets to be a hero and what a hero looks like. Before Shrek, the central characters of major animated feature films were almost universally beautiful by conventional standards. Even characters who were initially coded as ugly or outsider figures, like the Beast in Beauty and the Beast, were either revealed to be beautiful underneath or were surrounded by a visual language that made their outsider status temporary and correctable. The message, even when it was not intended, was that beauty and moral worth were connected, that the good and the worthy would ultimately be revealed to be beautiful, and that ugliness was either a temporary condition to be overcome or a marker of villainy. Shrek disrupted this deeply embedded visual convention completely, and without apology. Shrek does not become handsome. He does not transform into a conventional hero. He remains an ogre from the first frame to the last, and the film insists, clearly and repeatedly, that this is not a limitation but simply the truth of who he is. Fiona's transformation at the end of the film makes the same point even more explicitly. The resolution of her story is not her becoming beautiful by conventional standards. It is her accepting and embracing the form that she had been taught to be ashamed of. These choices had a cultural impact that extended beyond the film itself. They gave permission, in a small but real way, to the idea that stories about people who do not look the way stories usually expect their heroes to look are not lesser stories. They contributed to a slowly evolving cultural conversation about diversity, representation, and the relationship between physical appearance and worth that has continued and deepened in the years since. The lasting historical place of Shrek in cinema. More than 2 decades after its release, Shrek occupies a place in the history of cinema that is secure and significant in multiple dimensions simultaneously. It is historically important as a technological achievement, as one of the films that demonstrated what CGI animation was capable of at a level of detail and expressiveness that had not previously been achieved. It is historically important as a commercial phenomenon, as one of the films that proved animated features could compete at the very highest level of mainstream Hollywood box office performance. It is historically important as a cultural document, as a film that captured and reflected and helped shape a particular moment in the cultural life of the early 21st century in ways that continue to be felt. And it is historically important as an artistic statement, as a film that used the tools of popular entertainment to make genuinely complex and meaningful points about beauty, belonging, class, and the gap between the life that stories tell us we should want and the life that turns out to actually make us happy. The fact that all of these dimensions of significance exist simultaneously in a film that is also genuinely funny, genuinely moving, and enormously enjoyable to watch is perhaps its greatest achievement. It is a film that works on every level it attempts, and it attempts more levels than almost anyone expected from an animated film about a green ogre and a talking donkey. That combination of ambition and accessibility, of cultural seriousness and genuine entertainment, is what makes it not just a successful film but a historically important one, a film whose place in the record of what cinema has achieved and what it can mean is entirely deserved and entirely permanent.